Over the past few months, microgrids have featured in the news a lot. There's the RFS system in the Free State, together with their court battle with Eskom and the local municipality. There's Coral Beach Estate, an estate in the Eastern Cape that has solved its load shedding and cable theft issues with a microgrid. And there's the microgrid that was recently completed in Alexandra in Johannesburg. Microgrids are an effective alternative to simply getting power from the national grid, offering resilience, efficiency, and sustainability benefits. But they also have their challenges. What are some of these challenges, and how can we overcome them to benefit from this technological innovation? My name is Shanley. Welcome to my channel. If your home or business is powered by electricity from a municipality or from the national electricity utility, Eskom in South Africa, then you're connected to the national electricity grid. The electricity grid is a network of power lines across the country, connecting power stations where electricity is produced to electricity users where electricity is consumed. The grid is the means by which electrical energy moves from a power station to an electricity consumer. In South Africa, our grid consists of a wide range of electricity producers and electricity consumers. On the producer side, we have coal-fired power stations, nuclear power stations, gas turbines, and renewable energy as well. We also have storage plants, like the pumped storage plants in KwaZulu-Natal. On the consumer side, we have everything from mines and smelters to homes, schools, traffic lights, and everything in between. It's a balancing act to keep the grid operational. Eskom, the electricity utility, has to anticipate what the demand will be throughout the day and plan accordingly. If they know that there will be a peak, like in the morning and in the evening, then they need to ensure that they can meet the demand. If they know that there will be a dip in demand, like in the middle of the day, then they need to either ramp down on the power supply or they need to store the additional power for use in the peak periods. One of the ways Eskom balances supply and demand is through pumped storage. When there is excess power supply available, power is used to pump water from a lower dam to a higher dam. When the demand increases, the water is channeled from the higher dam to the lower dam through hydro turbines, producing electricity. Pumped storage plants are essentially large batteries. They are an effective way to store excess power for use later. When demand is much higher than supply and there is no emergency capacity available, the utility needs to reduce the demand. This is done by rotational power cuts, also known as load shedding. If the utility does not implement load shedding, we could have a national blackout. To understand this, think about what happens at your home when you overload a plug. Your electricity trips. To correct this, you simply switch off the device that's consuming a lot of power or causing the fault. You go to your distribution board and you switch the power back on. This is similar in concept to what would happen if the utility doesn't implement load shedding. The demand would be too high and we would essentially trip the country's power supply. However, since the power stations producing power also make use of some of the power they produce in their production process, it's not that simple to turn everything back on again. Imagine if your distribution board switch was an automatic switch and required a small trickle of electricity to turn it back on. You would need electricity to turn on your electricity. This is similar to the situation we would find ourselves in. There are only a few power stations that can start the country back up if we have a national blackout. It takes a lot of forethought, planning, and operational gymnastics to keep the grid online and to prevent a national blackout. As much as we hate load shedding, the fact that we have a schedule and that the blackouts happen according to schedule demonstrates that there are still a lot of things being done right at Eskom. So that's the national grid. So what is a microgrid? A microgrid is essentially a small micro version of the national grid. It also consists of a network of power stations where electricity is produced, electricity users where electricity is consumed, and power lines that get the power from the power stations to the consumers. But instead of large coal-fired power stations and nuclear power stations, the power stations are much smaller in scale. Rather, they could consist of solar panels on roofs, solar farms, battery storage systems, and generators fueled by diesel or gas. On the electricity consumer side, It could be a single building, a group of buildings, a group of houses in a housing complex, or a small town. If you live in a gated community, you could set up a microgrid for all of the houses in that gated community. You could also include solar panels on your roof and on all your neighbors' roofs in that microgrid. You could use a vacant piece of land or one of the residents' big backyard to set up a small solar farm, a battery storage system, and perhaps diesel generators. You could also implement a costing mechanism per unit of electricity to ensure that everyone in the community benefiting from the system is paying for the benefit. A microgrid like this can ensure that your community always has power, regardless of what is happening in the rest of the country. There are, of course, regulations that you would need to comply with, but it's certainly doable. But here's where things get a bit tricky. Just like the national utility performs a balancing act between supply and demand by planning, ramping supply up and down, storing excess power, and implementing load shedding when supply cannot match demand, your microgrid would need to have a way of doing the same thing, just at a smaller scale. Microgrids have limited power, relatively speaking, of course, and so control and protection are the main challenges in these systems. If you are connected to the national grid and your neighbor suddenly switches on some equipment that requires a lot of power, it's not going to affect the grid that much. They would have to start up something like an aluminium smelter for there to be any noticeable effect on the grid, which is highly unlikely. The national grid has much more capacity available than any equipment that your neighbor would reasonably power up. But in a microgrid setup, this changes. Your neighbor could power up some equipment that takes the microgrid close to capacity or even over capacity. The result would be a power outage in the microgrid. You and all your neighbors could be left in the dark until the system is powered back up again. So, while a microgrid can be a good solution to local energy security, proper planning of the system, proper operation of the system, and proper maintenance of the system are important. Another benefit of microgrids is a reduction in energy costs. When you pay your municipal electricity bill, you're not just paying for the cost of producing electricity. On top of the base cost of electricity, you're also paying the cost of transmission to get the power to your home, and you're paying the municipality's markup that they place on the cost of what they buy the electricity for from the utility. In a microgrid setup, you have more control over the costs and you don't have to pay a municipal markup. You are also in a position to optimize the cost of the electricity. The national grid still consists largely of coal-based power, which is far more expensive than power from renewable energy per unit of electricity. By making renewable energy a larger part of the energy supply in your microgrid, you reduce the overall cost of electricity. The microgrid control system can also be set up to choose the most cost-effective source of energy supply in real time. If the microgrid consists of a renewable energy supply, diesel generators, a battery storage system, and can also receive power from the national grid, the power being supplied to the consumers can be selected in real time based on many factors, such as the time of use tariff of electricity from the grid, the state of charge of the batteries, availability of solar power, the cost of diesel, and the availability of the national grid. And this selection process can be optimized for least cost, energy security, or longevity of the system. I've said a lot about microgrids, and it may be a bit confusing at this point. So perhaps right now, let's get into the different types of microgrid systems. Firstly, we have grid-connected microgrids. These microgrids are connected to the main grid and can operate in parallel with it, exchanging electricity based on demand and supply conditions. The grid-connected microgrid remains connected to the main electricity grid at all times. There may be renewable energy, such as solar PV, supplied within the microgrid, but the microgrid can draw electricity from the main grid during times of high demand or when renewable energy generation is not sufficient. This is similar to having a grid-tied solar installation at your home, except on a larger scale that includes multiple buildings. A grid-connected microgrid is ideal for locations where the grid is reliable, but the consumers would like to benefit from cheaper electricity from the sun. Next, we have islanded microgrids. Islanded microgrids are capable of operating independently from the main grid. They're also called off-grid microgrids. These microgrids have sufficient electricity supply and storage capabilities within them to meet the energy demand, and they have the necessary control in place to match supply with demand, including reducing demand when necessary. They are ideal for locations where the main electricity grid is not available, or where connection to the main electricity grid is not economically feasible. Then there are hybrid microgrids. Hybrid microgrids consist of multiple sources of energy, including renewable energy, conventional generators, and energy storage, and also connect to the main electricity grid. However, they are not reliant on the main electricity grid. They can operate independently from the grid when there is a power outage or when grid power is not the most cost-effective source of electricity supply. Hybrid microgrids integrate all of the available energy sources to optimize reliability and cost-effectiveness. Hybrid microgrids are ideal for locations where a grid connection is available, but where power cuts can be an issue. They are also ideal for locations where users want to optimize the cost of electricity and improve the reliability of supply. Implementing a microgrid provides an opportunity to make use of the best technology available for reliability and cost effectiveness, something that might be lacking in older and pre-existing infrastructure. Again, there are several challenges that need to be addressed in establishing a microgrid, but overall, the benefits are worth surmounting these challenges, especially with the increased availability and improvement in solar PV technology. Are you considering a microgrid? Which type of microgrid makes the most sense in your setting? Please let me know in the comments section. Until next time, this is Shanley.